In the predictable rhythm of Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio has learned to anticipate certain patterns in how defendants approach their cases. Most people arrive with prepared explanations, carefully crafted narratives designed to minimize their responsibility or maximize sympathy for their circumstances. But on this bright spring morning in April, a teenager would walk into his courtroom and do something so unexpected, so profoundly honest, that it would leave Judge Caprio speechless and remind everyone present about the transformative power of truth-telling in a world that often rewards deception. The defendant's name was Jordan Martinez, and at 16 years old, he carried himself with an unusual combination of nervousness and determination that immediately caught Judge Caprio's attention. Jordan was tall for his age, with dark hair carefully combed for this court appearance, wearing a button-down shirt and khaki pants that had clearly been chosen to show respect for the proceedings. But what truly distinguished Jordan was his expression, not the defiant scowl or fearful anxiety that many teenage defendants displayed, but rather a look of intense focus mixed with what appeared to be profound internal conflict, as if he was preparing to do something difficult but necessary. Walking beside Jordan was his mother, Carmen Martinez, a woman in her early 40s whose expression revealed a complex mixture of emotions: pride, worry, confusion, and what appeared to be surprise at whatever her son was about to do. The way she kept glancing at Jordan with questioning eyes suggested that even she wasn't entirely sure what was about to happen in this courtroom, that her son had told her he needed to come to court but hadn't fully explained his reasons. Jordan had been cited 3 weeks earlier for running a red light at a busy intersection downtown. According to the citation, a traffic camera had captured his vehicle entering the intersection after the light had turned red, a clear violation that carried a fine of $150 and 2 points on his driving record. On paper, it seemed like a straightforward case. Either Jordan had run the light or he hadn't, either the camera evidence was accurate or it wasn't. As Jordan and his mother approached the defendant's stand, Judge Caprio noticed something unusual in the file before him. Attached to Jordan's citation was a handwritten letter, several pages long, that Jordan had mailed to the court 2 weeks after receiving his ticket. The judge hadn't had time to read the letter in detail before the hearing, but its presence suggested that this case involved more than just a simple traffic violation. "Good morning, Jordan," Judge Caprio said with his characteristic warmth, immediately noticing the way the teenager straightened at being addressed by his first name rather than as the defendant or Mr. Martinez. "I see you're here regarding a red light violation that was captured by a traffic camera. Before we look at the evidence, I notice you sent a letter to the court. Can you tell me what prompted you to write that letter?" Jordan took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as he prepared to speak. When his voice came, it was quiet but steady, carrying the careful cadence of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. "Your Honor, I wrote that letter because I needed to tell the truth about what happened that day, even though telling the truth might make my situation worse instead of better," Jordan began, his words immediately distinguishing him from typical defendants who approached court proceedings with the goal of minimizing consequences rather than prioritizing honesty. "I know that most people who come to traffic court try to find ways to get their tickets dismissed or reduced. But I'm here because I did something wrong, and I need to take responsibility for it in a way that goes beyond just paying a fine." Judge Caprio felt his attention sharpen as Jordan spoke about taking responsibility in ways that transcended financial penalties. The judge had heard thousands of defendants make pro forma statements about accepting responsibility, but there was something different in Jordan's tone and demeanor that suggested his commitment to accountability was genuine and profound. "I want to start by being completely honest about the traffic violation," Jordan continued, his words revealing an unusual level of transparency. "Yes, I ran that red light. The camera evidence is accurate. I entered the intersection after the signal had turned red, which was dangerous and illegal. But I need to explain the circumstances that led to that violation, not to excuse what I did, but to help you understand why I'm here today asking for something very specific from this court." The distinction Jordan was making, between explaining circumstances and making excuses, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of personal responsibility that impressed Judge Caprio. The judge leaned forward, sensing that Jordan's explanation would reveal complexities that went far beyond a simple traffic citation. Your Honor, I need to tell you about what was happening in my life on the day I received this citation, Jordan said, his narrative beginning to provide the context that would make his honesty even more remarkable. 3 weeks ago, I was driving home from my after-school job at a grocery store where I work as a stock clerk. I've had this job for 8 months, and I've been saving money to help pay for college next year. The mention of employment and college plans immediately provided Judge Caprio with important information about Jordan's character and priorities. Here was a teenager who was working while attending school and planning for his future, suggesting responsibility and ambition that contrasted sharply with the stereotypes often applied to young drivers cited for traffic violations. As I was driving home that day, I received a phone call from my younger brother Miguel, Jordan continued, his voice taking on an urgent tone as he remembered the circumstances. Miguel is 13, and he called me in a panic to tell me that something was wrong at home, that I needed to get there as quickly as possible. He wouldn't tell me what was wrong over the phone, but I could hear the fear in his voice. The emergency phone call that Jordan described provided immediate context for understanding why he might have been driving in a way that led to a traffic violation. Judge Caprio could imagine the surge of adrenaline and fear that would accompany receiving such a call from a younger sibling, the immediate shift from normal driving to emergency response. I was about 2 miles from home when I got that call, Jordan explained, his words beginning to connect the emergency to the traffic violation. I immediately started driving faster, trying to get home to help Miguel with whatever crisis was happening. I was scared and not thinking clearly about traffic laws. I was just focused on getting to my brother as quickly as possible. Judge Caprio could see where Jordan's narrative was heading, and he understood that the teenager was describing the kind of situation where normal judgment could be compromised by fear and urgency. But the judge sensed that there was more to Jordan's story than just a moment of panic-driven poor decision-making. When I approached the intersection where I received this citation, the light was yellow, Jordan said, his detailed recollection suggesting he had thought carefully about the sequence of events. I knew I should stop, but I also knew that stopping would delay me by another minute or two, and I was desperate to get home to Miguel. So I made a conscious decision to accelerate through the intersection, hoping I would make it before the light turned red. The admission that Jordan had made a conscious choice rather than simply making a mistake in judgment elevated his level of culpability, but also demonstrated his commitment to absolute honesty about his actions. Judge Caprio understood that Jordan could have claimed he misjudged the timing or hadn't seen the light changing, but instead he was acknowledging that he had knowingly taken a risk. I didn't make it through before the light turned red, Jordan admitted, his voice carrying genuine regret. The camera captured me entering the intersection after the signal had changed. I knew immediately that I had probably been caught by the traffic camera, but in that moment I was more concerned about getting home to Miguel than about a potential ticket. The prioritization of family emergency over legal compliance was understandable and human, but Judge Caprio could see that Jordan was building towards something more significant than simply explaining why he had run the red light. The judge waited patiently for Jordan to continue his story, understanding that the full significance of his honesty would emerge as the narrative unfolded. When I got home, I found Miguel sitting on our front steps, visibly upset, Jordan said, his words revealing the resolution of the emergency that had prompted his urgent driving. He told me what had happened, and I realized that the emergency that had seemed so critical was actually something that could have waited, something that didn't justify the risk I had taken by running that red light. As Jordan described arriving home to find his brother Miguel upset but safe, Judge Caprio could sense that the teenager was approaching a moment of painful recognition that would transform his understanding of his own actions. The courtroom had fallen into attentive silence as everyone present understood they were hearing something unusual, a young person engaging in genuine self-reflection rather than simply trying to avoid consequences. When Miguel told me why he had called me so urgently, I felt my stomach drop, Jordan continued, his voice carrying the embarrassment and regret of someone reliving a moment they wished they could change. He had forgotten his house key that morning and was locked out after school. He had a big project due the next day and was panicking about not being able to get inside to work on it. That was the emergency. My brother needed a ride home and access to the house so he could do his homework. The revelation that the urgent situation had been nothing more than a forgotten key and homework anxiety created a stark contrast with Jordan's dangerous driving response. Judge Caprio could see the shame and self-recrimination in Jordan's expression as he acknowledged the disproportion between the actual situation and his reckless reaction to it. I stood there looking at Miguel, safe and basically fine except for being stressed about homework, and I realized what I had done, Jordan said, his words revealing the moment when his perspective had shifted dramatically. I had run a red light, potentially endangering myself and other drivers, because my brother had forgotten his house key. I had made a split-second decision that could have resulted in a serious accident, maybe even fatalities, all because I wasn't thinking clearly about the actual level of emergency involved. The self-awareness that Jordan demonstrated in analyzing his decision-making process impressed Judge Caprio. The teenager wasn't just accepting that he had broken a traffic law, he was engaging in sophisticated analysis of how fear and urgency had clouded his judgment and led him to take risks that were completely unjustified by the actual circumstances. That night, I couldn't sleep, Jordan admitted, his words revealing the beginning of the internal struggle that had ultimately brought him to court with such unusual honesty. I kept thinking about what could have happened at that intersection. What if there had been a car coming through on the green light that I hadn't seen? What if there had been a pedestrian crossing? What if my decision to run that red light had killed someone? The hypothetical scenarios that had tormented Jordan revealed his growing understanding of the potential consequences of his actions. Judge Caprio understood that Jordan was grappling with the gap between what had actually happened and what could have happened, recognizing that luck rather than good judgment had prevented tragedy. Over the next few days, I started researching traffic accidents caused by drivers running red lights, Jordan continued, his narrative revealing how his guilt had motivated him to educate himself about the broader context of his violation. I found statistics from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration showing that running red lights causes hundreds of deaths and tens of thousands of injuries every year in the United States. I read stories about families destroyed because someone made the same decision I made, to run a light because they were in a hurry or thought they could make it through safely. The research that Jordan had conducted demonstrated both his intellectual engagement with his mistake and his desire to understand the larger implications of behavior he had previously thought of as a minor traffic violation. Judge Caprio could see that Jordan had transformed a personal error into an opportunity for learning about systemic problems with driver safety and decision-making. "The more I learned, the worse I felt," Jordan said, his voice carrying genuine anguish. "I realized that I was exactly the kind of driver that causes those accidents, someone who knew better but made a bad decision anyway because I convinced myself that my situation was special, that my reasons justified breaking the rules that exist to keep everyone safe." The recognition that he fit a pattern of dangerous driving behavior rather than being a unique exception was clearly painful for Jordan. Judge Caprio understood that this teenager was confronting uncomfortable truths about himself and his judgment, choosing honesty about his failures over the more comfortable option of minimizing or rationalizing his behavior. "I read about a case in Ohio where a 17-year-old ran a red light and killed a mother and her 2 young children who were crossing the intersection legally," Jordan continued, his words revealing how deeply he had internalized the potential consequences of his actions. "The driver said he was rushing to get to work and thought he could make it through." The judge in that case said that split-second decisions made by careless drivers have permanent, devastating consequences for innocent people. The specific example that Jordan cited demonstrated that his research hadn't been abstract or theoretical, but had focused on real cases where real people had died because of decisions similar to his own. Judge Caprio could see that Jordan had deliberately exposed himself to the most painful aspects of his research, forcing himself to confront what could have resulted from his moment of poor judgment. "After reading that case, I went to the intersection where I had run the red light," Jordan explained, his words revealing how his guilt had manifested in concrete actions. "I stood on the corner and watched the traffic patterns. I saw families with young children crossing that intersection. I saw elderly people who would never have been able to avoid a speeding car. I saw cyclists and motorcyclists who would have been killed instantly if I had hit them." The pilgrimage that Jordan described, returning to the scene of his violation to visualize the potential victims of his recklessness, was remarkable in its demonstration of his commitment to fully understanding and accepting the implications of his actions. Judge Caprio had never heard a defendant describe such deliberate, painful engagement with the consequences of their behavior. "Standing at that intersection, I realized something important," Jordan said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had achieved a significant insight through difficult reflection. "The traffic citation I received wasn't really the problem. The fine of $150 wasn't really the punishment that mattered. The real issue was that I had betrayed my own values, that I had become the kind of person who prioritizes convenience over safety, who thinks rules don't apply when I'm in a hurry." The shift in Jordan's perspective from viewing the citation as an external punishment to recognizing it as a reflection of his own character was profound. Judge Caprio understood that this teenager had moved beyond simply regretting getting caught to genuinely regretting the person he had been in that moment of poor judgment. "Your Honor, that realization is what led me to write the letter to the court," Jordan explained, finally connecting his internal journey to his unusual decision to reach out before his court date. "I realized that simply paying a fine and accepting points on my license wasn't enough. Those are just external consequences that don't really change anything about who I am or how I think about responsibility. I needed to find a way to take responsibility that would actually mean something." Judge Caprio picked up the multi-page letter that Jordan had sent to the court, beginning to understand that its contents represented not just an explanation of circumstances but a proposal for a different kind of accountability. The judge could see that Jordan was building toward a request that would reveal the true depth of his commitment to meaningful responsibility. "Your Honor, in my letter to the court, I made a proposal that I want to explain to you in person," Jordan said, his determination evident. "I propose that in addition to paying the full fine and accepting the points on my license, I be allowed to perform 50 hours of community service specifically focused on traffic safety education for young drivers." Judge Caprio felt his eyebrows raise in surprise. Defendants typically asked for reduced penalties, not additional responsibilities. "Jordan, most people who come before me are trying to minimize their consequences, not add to them. Can you help me understand why you want to take on extra obligations?" "Because paying money doesn't change anything about who I am," Jordan explained passionately. "A fine is just something my parents would probably end up helping me pay. Points on my license are just numbers that will disappear eventually. But using my mistake to help prevent other young drivers from making similar decisions, that would actually mean something. That would turn my failure into something constructive." Jordan described how he had spent weeks developing a presentation about the dangers of distracted and reckless driving. He had contacted local high schools about speaking to drivers' education classes. He had researched teen driving statistics and created educational materials. "I want to stand in front of other teenagers and tell them honestly about the stupid decision I made and what could have happened. I want to be a living example of how a split-second bad decision can have consequences that last forever." His mother Carmen finally spoke up, her voice filled with emotion. "Your Honor, I've watched my son transform over these past 3 weeks. He's barely slept, consumed with guilt and determination to make this right. He's not just saying what he thinks you want to hear, he's genuinely committed to using this experience to help others." "Your Honor, there's something else I need to tell you," Jordan continued, his voice trembling slightly. "Something I haven't told anyone except my mom. The reason Miguel's call affected me so deeply wasn't just about him being locked out. It was about guilt I was already carrying." Judge Caprio leaned forward as Jordan prepared to reveal something even more personal. 6 months before this incident, my best friend Alex was seriously injured in a car accident, Jordan said, tears forming in his eyes. He was a passenger in a car where the driver ran a red light trying to beat the signal. Alex spent 2 weeks in the hospital with a broken leg and internal injuries. I visited him every day, and I promised myself I would never be that kind of reckless driver. The connection between Jordan's friend's accident and his own violation added profound significance to his guilt. "When I ran that red light, I didn't just break the law, I betrayed a promise I made to myself and to Alex. I became exactly the kind of driver I had judged so harshly when my friend got hurt. That's why I can't just pay a fine and move on. I need to prove to myself that I'm better than that moment of weakness." Jordan pulled out a folder containing his proposed traffic safety presentation, complete with statistics, personal testimony, and educational materials he had created. "I've already contacted 6 schools that are willing to let me speak to their drivers' education programs. I've created a presentation that's honest about my failure and the potential consequences. I want to reach at least 500 students before the end of the school year." Judge Caprio examined the materials, impressed by their professionalism and the obvious time and thought Jordan had invested. "Jordan, this is remarkable work. But I need to understand, why go to such lengths? Why not just accept the standard penalty and move on with your life?" "Because I'm 16 years old, and I'm going to be driving for potentially the next 60 or 70 years, Jordan responded with clarity. "This moment right now, this court appearance, this accountability, it will define what kind of driver I become for the rest of my life. I can either treat it as an inconvenience to get past, or I can use it as a turning point that makes me genuinely better and helps prevent other young people from making similar mistakes." Judge Caprio sat in profound silence, visibly moved by Jordan's extraordinary honesty and maturity. Tears streamed down the judge's face as he processed what this 16-year-old had demonstrated, a level of moral courage and authentic accountability that many adults never achieve. "Jordan Martinez," Judge Caprio finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "in 30 years on this bench, I have never encountered anyone who has demonstrated more genuine integrity, moral courage, and commitment to meaningful accountability than you have today. What you've done here isn't just impressive, it's transformative." The judge stood and walked around his desk. "I'm accepting your proposal, but I'm going to modify it. I'm reducing your fine to $50 and removing the points from your license, not as a reward, but because I believe the accountability you're proposing is far more valuable than traditional penalties." Jordan started to protest that he should pay the full fine, but Judge Caprio raised his hand gently. "Jordan, I'm making this decision because I believe you when you say the fine doesn't matter as much as meaningful action. I want you to take the money you would have spent on that fine and invest it in your traffic safety education program. Buy materials, create better presentations, expand your reach. Furthermore," Judge Caprio continued, "I'm going to personally connect you with the Rhode Island Department of Transportation's Teen Driver Safety Program. They need young advocates who can speak authentically to other teenagers about making safe choices behind the wheel. I believe your honesty and your personal story could save lives." Carmen Martinez was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the recognition her son was receiving. Judge Caprio addressed her directly. "Mrs. Martinez, you have raised an extraordinary young man. The values and integrity Jordan has demonstrated today are direct reflections of the parenting he's received." Judge Caprio then did something unprecedented. He asked Jordan if he would be willing to speak to other defendants in his courtroom about accountability and taking responsibility. "Your example of choosing to add consequences rather than avoid them, of transforming shame into service, that's something everyone who appears before me could learn from." Jordan agreed enthusiastically, his face showing relief, gratitude, and renewed determination. "Your Honor, I promise I will reach at least 500 students this year. I will be honest about my failure and use it to help others make better choices. And I will never forget that you believed in me enough to turn my worst moment into an opportunity to serve." As Jordan and his mother prepared to leave, Judge Caprio had one final message. "Jordan, what you did today, choosing radical honesty over self-protection, choosing service over minimization, that's the definition of character. You came here expecting judgment and left with an opportunity. But more importantly, you came here as someone who made a mistake, and you're leaving as someone who has the integrity to transform that mistake into meaning." The courtroom erupted in applause as Jordan and Carmen walked out, many observers wiping tears from their eyes. Judge Caprio's voice carried through the room. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. And sometimes the greatest punishment for a person of conscience is the opportunity to prove they're better than their worst moment. Jordan's story would indeed reach far beyond those 500 students. His presentation would be shared online, viewed millions of times, and adopted by drivers' education programs across the country. He would become a youth advocate for traffic safety, speaking at conferences and working with legislators on teen driver safety initiatives. But perhaps most importantly, he would carry with him always the knowledge that honesty, even when it's difficult, even when it might lead to worse consequences, is always the right choice, and that true accountability means transforming our failures into opportunities to serve others.